The air in Silas Blackwood's barn smelled of hay, horse, and the cold, mineral scent of the earth. Elspeth stood straight, her hands clasped before her to keep them from fidgeting. She had rehearsed this. She had stripped it of all sentiment, all apology, until it was nothing but the bare, hard frame of a business proposition. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice steady in the quiet space. He stopped his work, turning from the harness he was mending. Silas was not a tall man, but he was built of a solid, dense material, like old lumber. His eyes, the color of a winter sky before a storm, met hers without preamble. He simply waited. "I have a proposal for you," she said, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "It is a matter of legal necessity. My homestead claim, the one north of Chugwater Creek, requires final proof by spring. The land office clerk in Cheyenne has made it plain that a single woman's claim is scrutinized. A married woman's claim, however, is considered secure." She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Understanding, perhaps. He said nothing. "I require a husband," she stated, the word feeling foreign and ill-fitting in her mouth. "In name only. We would sign the papers at the courthouse. You would continue to live here, I there. No commingling of property save for what the law requires. No expectations, no duties beyond the signature on the deed. When the patent is granted, we can have it dissolved, should you wish." He wiped his hands on a rag, his movements deliberate. He looked past her, out the open barn door toward the vast, empty expanse of Wyoming prairie that separated his land from hers. He was a man who seemed to take the measure of a thing by looking at the space around it. "Why me?" he finally asked. His voice was low, rough-edged like stones rubbing together. "Because you are a quiet man," Elspeth answered, the truth of it simple and unadorned. "You keep to yourself, you do not gossip, and you have no family here to complicate the matter." It was a stark assessment, bordering on cruel, but it was also the foundation of her choice. Silas considered this. He looked at her worn but clean dress, the determined set of her jaw, the way she stood as if braced for a wind that was always blowing. He gave a single, short nod. "All right, Miss Hayes." "It would be Mrs. Blackwood," she corrected, the name a strange weight on her tongue. He nodded again, a ghost of something unreadable on his lips. "All right." And that was that. No handshake, no smile, just an agreement as plain and unyielding as the winter ground. They both knew what this was not. It was not a romance, not a rescue, not even the beginning of a friendship. It was a signature, a practical solution to a practical problem. Neither of them looked happy, but neither was dishonest. The wedding, if one could call it that, was a 5-minute affair in a dusty office in Cheyenne. The justice of the peace mumbled the words. They both said, "I do," with the same flat intonation one might use to confirm a delivery of feed, and then they signed the ledger. Elspeth signed Elspeth Hayes, then crossed it out and carefully wrote Elspeth Blackwood. The name felt like a borrowed coat, too large in the shoulders. They rode back toward their separate homesteads in near silence. As they reached the fork in the trail that led to their respective cabins, Silas reined in his horse. "The arrangement stands," he said. It was not a question. "It does," she confirmed. He looked at her, then a long, searching look that made her feel, for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty. "Winter will be here soon. Your woodpile is low." "I'm aware," she said, a touch of frost in her voice. She had managed one winter alone. She would manage another. She would not be managed herself. He simply nodded and turned his horse down his own path, leaving her alone with the wide sky and her new, terribly convenient name. Winter arrived not as a guest but as an occupying army. It came with a wind that stripped the last hardy leaves from the cottonwoods and a cold that settled deep into the bones of the land. Elspeth was prepared. Her soddy was banked, her larder was full, and her determination was as solid as the frozen earth. She was a woman who knew the geometry of survival. But the arrangement began to change that geometry in small, almost imperceptible ways. One morning, after a night of particularly vicious wind, she opened her door to find a neat stack of split pine on her porch, far more than her own axe could have produced in a day. There was no note. There was no sign of him, but the wood was there, smelling of resin and the cold. She felt a prickle of something she refused to name, not gratitude, but a complicated annoyance. The terms were clear. No duties. This felt like one. 2 days later, she noticed the heavy canvas coat he always wore had a long, fraying tear near the elbow. While he was out checking his fences, she walked the half-mile to his cabin, her sewing kit in her pocket. His home was even more Spartan than hers. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a stove. It was meticulously clean. She took the coat from its peg by the door, sat in one of his chairs, and mended the tear with small, even stitches. She left it folded neatly on the table with a loaf of sourdough bread beside it. It was not a gift. It was a balancing of the ledger. They rarely spoke. Sometimes they would pass on the trail to Iron Mountain, the nearest settlement for supplies. They would nod. Mr. Blackwood. Mrs. Blackwood. The name always landed strangely between them, a fact that was both true and entirely false. She took to watching him from her window. She learned the rhythm of his days. The way he moved had a kind of quiet purpose that she found herself studying. He never rushed. He never wasted emotion. When he worked with his mule, his hands were firm but gentle. She saw him one afternoon standing perfectly still in the snow, watching a hawk circle overhead, and for a moment the harsh lines of his face softened. He was a man of immense stillness, and Elspeth, who lived a life of constant motion and planning, found it both foreign and compelling. The humor, when it came, was as dry as the winter air. Her mule, a creature of profound and unshakable obstinacy named Clementine, had decided the middle of the trail was the perfect place for a nap. No amount of pulling or pleading would move her. As Elspeth stood there, hands on her hips, muttering curses at the beast, Silas rode up. He took in the scene, Elspeth glaring, Clementine looking beatific with her eyes closed, and a slow smile touched his lips. "She has a strong opinion," he observed. "She has a thick skull," Elspeth retorted, exasperated. He dismounted, walked over to the mule, and whispered something in its long, furry ear. To Elspeth's utter astonishment, Clementine blinked, gave a great sigh, and got to her feet. Silas tipped his hat. "Just had to ask her proper." He rode off, leaving Elspeth staring after him, a reluctant laugh caught in her throat. It was the longest conversation they'd had since the day in his barn. The blizzard began as a whisper of snow, then a murmur, and then a full-throated roar that consumed the world in a churning vortex of white. For 3 days, Elspeth was a prisoner in her soddy. On the 4th day, the wind died, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence and a world buried in white. It was then she heard the drip. It started slowly, a single, fat drop of water hitting a tin plate she'd left on the table, then another, and another. She looked up. A dark, spreading stain was blooming on the sod and timber roof. The weight of the snow, now melting slightly in the pale sun, had found a weak point. For hours, she fought it. She moved her precious sacks of flour and seed. She placed every bucket and pan she owned to catch the water. She climbed onto a chair, trying to stuff rags into the breach, but the flow only worsened. The cold, muddy water ran down her arms, soaking her dress. The cabin grew colder. The drip became a steady, demoralizing trickle. She was capable. She was independent. She had never asked for help. But as she stood shivering in the growing gloom, the smell of damp earth filling her small home, she knew she could not fix this alone. The water was threatening not just her comfort, but her future. That seed grain was her spring planting. That flour was her winter bread. Pride was a luxury she could not afford. Swallowing the hard, bitter knot of it, she pulled on her boots and his mended coat, which she had taken to wearing for its superior warmth, and stepped out into the blinding snow. The walk to his cabin was a battle. The snow was waist-deep in places, and the cold was a physical blow. Every step was an argument with herself. This was not part of the arrangement. This was a failing. This was admitting a weakness. When she finally reached his door, she was covered in snow and trembling, more from exhaustion than cold. She didn't knock. She didn't have the strength. She simply pushed the door open. Silas was at his table, cleaning a rifle. He looked up, and his face changed in a way she had never seen. The stillness vanished, replaced by an immediate, sharp concern. He was on his feet in an instant, crossing the room to her. "The roof," was all she could manage to say, her teeth chattering. "It's failing." He didn't ask questions. He took her by the arm, sat her in the chair by the stove, and pushed a mug of hot coffee into her hands. "Stay," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Then he pulled on his own coat and went out into the snow, heading for her cabin. He was gone for over an hour. When he returned, he was covered in mud and melting snow. "I've patched it for now," he said, his breath pluming in the cold air as he entered. "It will hold until a proper thaw. But your firewood is soaked, and half your supplies need moving." They worked for the rest of the day in a shared, silent rhythm. He split fresh, dry wood from his own pile and hauled it to her soddy. Together, they moved the damp sacks of flour to the driest corner and stacked them on salvaged planks. They worked in the close confines of her small cabin, their shoulders sometimes brushing. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, wood smoke, and their own exertion. The silence between them was different now. It was not the silence of distance, but of shared purpose. As dusk fell, they sat at her small table, exhausted, a single lamp casting a warm glow over the room. The dripping had stopped. The fire in the stove crackled, warm and bright. He looked at the patched ceiling, then at her. His face was grim. "You should have come sooner," he said, his voice low. Elspeth looked down at her hands. She had expected him to say something about the arrangement, about how this was beyond the terms. But his tone held no accusation. It held something else, something that sounded almost like reproach for her suffering alone. "I am accustomed to managing my own affairs," she said quietly. "This is my affair too," he replied, and the words fell into the quiet room with the weight of stones. "Your name is Blackwood. Your roof is my concern." She looked up at him then, truly looked at him. And in the steady gaze of this quiet, practical man, she saw the terms of their agreement dissolving like smoke. This was no longer about a signature on a piece of paper. The winter the silent offerings of wood and mending, the shared fight against the storm. They had forged something else, something real. The arrangement had been for the land, but the winter, she realized, had been for them. In the days that followed the blizzard, a new kind of quiet settled between them. It was not the silence of strangers, but the watchful, waiting silence of two people who have seen past a carefully constructed artifice. The patch on her roof held. The world outside thawed into a muddy, messy promise of spring. Silas came by most evenings ostensibly to check the roof or to bring her a piece of news from town. They would sit for a while, sometimes talking of practical things, the price of seed, the condition of the trail, but mostly sitting in a comfortable quiet that had become its own language. Elspeth found she no longer felt the need to fill the space with words. His presence was enough. It was a steady, grounding thing in her world. One evening, he arrived with nothing in his hands. He didn't mention the roof. He simply stood in her doorway, turning his hat over and over in his hands. "Elspeth," he began, and the use of her given name was a quiet shock. "The land office sent word. The patent was approved. The land is yours, officially." She felt a surge of triumph, sharp and clear. This was what it had all been for. The loneliness, the hardship, the cold, the strange, counterfeit marriage. It had worked. She had won. That's good news, Silas." "It is," he agreed, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. He took a breath. "The arrangement is concluded. You have what you needed." The words hung in the air. This was the end point they had agreed upon. She was free. He was free. She should have felt relief. Instead, a hollow, aching feeling opened in her chest. She thought of the long winter ahead, the silence of this cabin without the possibility of his footsteps in the snow. He finally looked up, and his gaze was direct, stripped bare of all pretense. "The thing is," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name, "I find the terms insufficient." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. He had laid his truth at her feet, a plain and honest offering. He had not asked for anything, had not pressured her. He had simply stated a fact, as he might state that the creek was running high, or that a frost was due. And then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, he turned and walked back to his own cabin, leaving her alone with his words. Elspeth stood in the doorway for a long time, watching his retreating back. The terms were insufficient. He was right. A business deal could not account for the feeling of seeing fresh-cut wood on her porch. It could not explain the quiet satisfaction of mending his coat. It could not contain the shared warmth of a fire after a battle with a storm. She had built her life around independence, guarding it like a fortress. She had thought this arrangement was a way to protect it. But she saw now that her fortress had a window, and through it, she had been watching Silas Blackwood. She had watched him be steady and kind and strong. She had watched him be a good man, and she had come to rely on his presence more than she had ever relied on anyone. The difference between being alone and being lonely had become starkly, painfully clear. She made her decision. It was not a grand, romantic revelation. It was a simple, quiet knowing, as solid and real as the land under her feet. That evening, she baked a fresh loaf of bread and stewed the last of a salted ham. She put it all in a basket, pulled on her shawl, and walked the familiar path to his cabin. A light glowed in his window. He opened the door, his face a mask of surprise. He had clearly not expected to see her. She held out the basket. I brought you supper, she said. Her voice was even, but her heart was beating a loud, insistent rhythm against her ribs. He took the basket, his fingers brushing hers. He looked from the basket to her face, a question in his eyes. Elspeth met his gaze. She took a small step, crossing the threshold from the cold night into the warm, lamplit air of his home. Husband, she said, and for the first time, the word felt like it belonged to her. It was not a legal term or a convenience. It was a choice, a beginning, a new set of terms, unwritten, to be discovered together. A slow smile spread across Silas Blackwood's face, reaching his eyes and filling them with a light she had never seen before. Come in, Elspeth, he said softly. You're welcome here.